True evil does not look like a monster. It looks like a civilized man in a tuxedo who has just decided that your life is worth less than his cocktail. Foy D. Kohler is that man. Standing in the golden warmth of the American Embassy in 1948, he is committing a sin that has no name. He is listening to the silent screams of thousands of American soldiers dying in the dark, and he is choosing to turn up the music to drown them out. He is not a diplomat. He is a butcher with a balance sheet. He has looked into the frozen hell of Siberia, saw his own countrymen begging for rescue, and quietly closed the door simply to keep the draft out. It is a massacre performed with a smile. History will later remember him as the calm voice during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the steady hand on the wheel of nuclear de-escalation. But the light in this room is deceptive, hiding the shadows that stretch long and dark into the corners. While Kohler sips his drink and exchanges polite trivialities with a Soviet functionary, a ghost stands beside him, invisible to the guests but heavy in the room, wearing a padded jacket stiff with lice and frozen sweat, possessing the face of an American boy from Ohio or Texas who is currently freezing to death in a camp that officially does not exist. Kohler looks right through him because he has to, for acknowledging the ghost would ruin the evening and complicate the cables he must write in the morning. To see the suffering would upset the delicate, terrifying equilibrium of the Cold War. So the champagne glass raises. The toast is offered to understanding. And in the silence that follows the crystal clink, the snow continues to bury the living. The Second World War did not truly end. It merely changed temperature, cooling from the firebombings of Dresden and Tokyo into a deep, pervasive frost where the euphoria of victory rotted into a paranoid exhaustion. By 1947, the map of the world lay broken on the table, and the Soviet Union, once a desperate ally, now loomed as a monolithic threat that required a new kind of soldier. Washington had no appetite for another war, leaving the atomic bomb sitting in the arsenal as a weapon too terrible to use, creating a paradox where total destruction ensured that soldiers could no longer march, shifting the battlefield from the trenches to the embassy reception rooms where the warrior was retired and the diplomat ascended. Foy Kohler was the prototype of this new breed, a creature of the State Department molded by the belief that stability was the highest moral good and that indignation was a weakness of the amateur. He spoke Russian fluently, understood the gears of the Kremlin, and prided himself on a lack of emotion, viewing nations not as collections of people but as chess pieces, where the loss of a pawn is not a tragedy but a strategic adjustment. But pawns do not bleed, and pawns do not write letters home begging for rescue. Reports began to drift across Kohler's desk like dry leaves, coming from the chaotic borders of post-war Europe, detailing American soldiers liberated from German camps by the Red Army who were failing to appear at repatriation points. Pilots patrolling the edges of the Iron Curtain vanished into the static, and American citizens, engineers, dual nationals, embassy clerks were swallowed by the Soviet legal system without a trace. The intelligence was fragmented but consistent. Speaking of sightings in transit prisons in Odessa, whispered messages passed through released Austrian prisoners, and names scratched on the walls of train cars moving east. The evidence piled up in the secure vaults of the embassy, and Kohler saw it all, reading the files and knowing that the Soviet secret police operated a machine that consumed human beings and left no trace. He knew that to be arrested in Moscow was to step off the edge of the earth, yet the response was a calculated silence. A loud protest would damage relations, and a public demand for the return of these men would humiliate the Soviets, risking a walkout from the negotiating table. The logic was cold and circular. To preserve the peace, the victims of the peace had to be ignored. Kohler's days in Moscow followed a grim administrative rhythm, arriving at the chancery to review overnight telegrams from desperate families in America. Mothers wrote to their congressmen, and wives demanded answers, asking why the army said their husbands were missing when witnesses saw them alive in Poland. Kohler's job was to manage this despair, viewing these letters not as a call to arms, but as an administrative burden that needed to be filtered through the sieve of diplomatic language. The responses went out stating that inquiries were being made and the situation was complex, but confirmation was impossible because the Soviets lied with a blank face and a smile. When presented with a list of names, they would simply shrug and claim they had no such people. And Kohler accepted the lie not because he believed it, but because challenging it required a confrontation he was unwilling to provoke. In January 1949, this cynicism solidified into policy, as the embassy staff, demoralized by their own impotence, watched Kohler sit down to draft a comprehensive report to Washington. The typewriter keys struck the paper in a mechanical staccato as he wrote of bitter conclusions, detailing the stonewalling and the absolute refusal of the Soviet state to acknowledge the existence of the captives. It was a brilliant piece of analysis, clinically accurate in diagnosing the Soviet system as a paranoid bureaucracy that would never voluntarily release a prisoner, but the report lacked a pulse. It was an autopsy rather than a battle plan. Kohler was telling Washington that the patient was dead even while the men in the camps were still breathing, recommending no economic sanctions or leverage, simply stating the facts and washing his hands. The report traveled to Washington, was stamped secret, and circulated among the men who made the decisions, who nodded and agreed that the issue was intractable. Abandonment is rarely a sudden event. It is a slow process of erosion that happens when a file is moved from the urgent pile to the pending pile, or when a diplomat decides that a cocktail party is more important than a confrontation. For the men in the Gulag, the erosion was physical, watching the seasons change by the color of the ice and keeping themselves alive with the burning conviction that the United States would come for them. They did not know their files were sitting in a cabinet in Spaso House, categorized by Foy Kohler as political liabilities, their lives traded for the illusion of stability. The disconnect between the reality of the camp and the reality of the embassy is the true horror of this era, a deliberate choice to look away where the diplomat prioritized the process of diplomacy over its purpose. They preserved the channels of communication, using them to discuss grain quotas and cultural exchanges, while the screams of their own citizens were filtered out by the double-paned glass. Kohler moved through this world with a terrifying grace, mastering the art of cocktail diplomacy, knowing which vodka to praise and when to laugh at a Soviet joke, building relationships with the very men who signed the execution orders. He shook hands stained with invisible blood and did not flinch, embodying the professionalism that the State Department rewarded, the ability to sever the heart from the brain and call a crime geopolitics. As the 1940s bled into the 1950s, the silence deepened, and the men in the camps began to die of typhus, starvation, and despair. The letters from home stopped coming, blocked by censors, and the memory of America began to fade, replaced by the gray reality of the wire. Foy Kohler rose, his career flourishing as a man who could handle the Russians without sentiment, preparing for greater things like the Cuban Missile Crisis and the ambassadorship. But the foundation of his success was built on a graveyard where the ghost in the tuxedo grew colder, waiting for a recognition that would never come. The geography of the Cold War was never merely a matter of lines drawn on a map in Geneva or Yalta, nor was it defined solely by the distinct colors of alliances painted in school atlases. It was a geography of terror defined by the reach of the secret police. By the time Foy Kohler was settling into the upholstered comfort of his Moscow office, the Soviet Union had already perfected a parallel civilization, an invisible country within a country that Solzhenitsyn would later christen the Archipelago, an underworld that did not operate on the principles of diplomacy or international law, but on a crude industrial hunger for human muscle and bone. The diplomatic cables sent back to Washington spoke of 5-year plans and steel production quotas, often missing the grotesque reality that the steel was being forged by men and women who had officially ceased to exist, turning the Soviet Union from a geopolitical puzzle into a beast that had already swallowed its victims whole. The architecture of this system was deliberately designed to strip a man of his past before it killed his future, beginning with the journey itself, a transit that served as a violent baptism into non-existence. When an American soldier was snatched, whether from a jeep in Vienna, a checkpoint in Berlin, or a crash site in Korea, he was not immediately sent to the ice, but was first fed into the digestive tract of the Lubyanka, or the Lefortovo prison in Moscow. Here, the interrogation was not about extracting truth, but about manufacturing a new reality, forcing the prisoner to sign a confession in a language he did not understand, admitting to crimes of espionage or sabotage that existed only in the paranoid fantasies of his captors. Once the signature was obtained, the soldier was no longer a prisoner of war protected by the Geneva Convention. He was a convicted criminal under Article 58 of the Soviet Penal Code, a status that stripped him of all rights and made his disappearance a matter of internal Soviet law, shielding his captors from diplomatic inquiries. Foy Kohler and his colleagues in the embassy were not ignorant of these legal fictions. Having studied the Soviet judicial system with academic rigor, yet they failed to grasp the visceral horror of the implementation. They understood the theory of the purge, but could not smell the stench of the Stolypin cars, the windowless rail wagons modified to carry livestock and prisoners to the east. Inside these rolling coffins, 50 or 60 men were packed into a space designed for 20, standing in a slurry of their own filth, gasping for air through a single barred vent while the train rattled endlessly across the Eurasian steppe. The journey could last weeks, a slow rattling passage through a landscape of birch forests and empty plains, punctuated only by the sound of wooden mallets striking the wheels at stops to check for cracks, a sound that returning survivors would describe as the heartbeat of the Gulag. As the train moved further east, crossing the Urals and descending into the vast freezer of Siberia, the temperature inside the cars dropped to match the hostility of the landscape. Men who had survived the firefights of the Bulge or the aerial dogfights over the Pacific now found themselves fighting a war against their own biology, huddling together for warmth in a mass of shivering limbs, watching the weaker among them slip into the final sleep. The bodies of those who died in transit were not removed with dignity, but were often left in the car for days until the next scheduled stop, their frozen forms serving as a macabre reminder to the living that their value had been reduced to a head count on a manifest. When the doors finally rolled open at a railhead in Vorkuta or Magadan, the survivors were greeted not by the liberation they had prayed for, but by the barking of dogs and the shouts of guards whose breath steamed in the frigid air, marking their arrival at the terminus of the world. This sprawling network of camps was the hidden engine of the Soviet economy, a fact that the polite diplomats in Washington often chose to overlook in favor of analyzing grain yields and tank production, the gold that stabilized the ruble, the timber that built the cities, and the uranium that fueled the Soviet nuclear program were all extracted by a disposable workforce that cost nothing to maintain and could be replaced instantly. American detainees were thrown into this mix alongside German POWs, Japanese soldiers, and millions of Soviet citizens, their national identities erased by the uniformity of the padded jacket and the shaved head. In the eyes of the camp commandant, an American pilot was no different from a Ukrainian nationalist or a common thief. He was merely a unit of labor capable of moving a certain amount of earth before expiring. The dehumanization was absolute, designed to break the spirit long before the body gave out. A prisoner was no longer addressed by name, but by a number sewn onto his chest and back, a sequence of digits that became his entire identity in the camp ledger. The daily routine was a brutal cycle of exhaustion and starvation, waking at 4 a.m. to a breakfast of watery gruel and a chunk of black bread that was more sawdust than grain, followed by 12 to 14 hours of hard labor in temperatures that could snap steel. In the mines of Kolyma, men worked in shafts dug into the permafrost, inhaling dust that turned their lungs to stone, driven by quotas that were mathematically impossible to meet without cheating or dying. Failure to meet the quota meant a reduction in rations, a death spiral that ensured the weak became weaker until they were discarded into the mass graves that dotted the perimeter of every camp. Back in the warmth of the State Department, the policy of containment was being codified by brilliant men like George Kennan, who argued that the Soviet Union must be held in check until it collapsed from its own internal contradictions. This strategy was intellectually sound and ultimately successful, yet it possessed a fatal moral blind spot regarding the individuals trapped behind the lines. Containment was a strategy of patience, a long game that measured success in decades. But for a man freezing to death in a Siberian barrack, patience was not a strategy, it was a death sentence. The diplomats operated on a timeline of geopolitical evolution, waiting for the regime to soften, while the prisoners operated on a timeline of biological decay, where survival was measured in hours. The reports that did reach Washington during these years were often sanitized or dismissed as unverified rumors by men who found the truth too inconvenient to accept. A returning German soldier might report seeing an American in a camp near Irkutsk, describing his height, his accent, and even recalling a fragment of his home address. But by the time this information filtered through the intelligence agencies and reached the desk of a decision-maker like Kohler, it had been diluted by skepticism. The bureaucratic instinct was to doubt, to ask for corroborating evidence that was impossible to obtain, and to ultimately file the report away rather than risk a diplomatic incident on the basis of hearsay. This culture of skepticism became a shield for inaction, allowing the diplomats to feel rigorous and prudent while they effectively abandoned their citizens to a slow execution. The refusal to confront the Soviets on the issue of detainees was also driven by a fear of revealing the extent of American intelligence penetration. To present the Kremlin with a specific list of names and locations would be to admit that the U.S. had sources inside the Gulag system, or was debriefing returning Axis POWs with an intensity that violated the spirit of the post-war armistices. The game of espionage took precedence over the sanctity of life, creating a perverse logic where the knowledge of a crime prevented the rescue of the victim. The secrets were kept safe, the sources were protected, and the intelligence networks remained intact. But the men those networks were meant to serve were left to rot in the silence of the taiga. Inside the camps, however, the prisoners held on to a desperate, irrational faith in their government, a belief that sustained them through the darkest nights. They whispered rumors of secret negotiations, of impending exchanges, of a fleet of American planes that would appear on the horizon to carry them home. They carved their names into the wooden bunks and scratched messages onto pieces of scrap metal, hoping that someday someone would find these tokens and know that they had been there. This hope was their only defense against the madness of the Gulag, a psychological anchor that kept them from surrendering to the void, even as their bodies withered and their memories of home began to fragment under the pressure of the cold. The tragedy was that this faith was misplaced, directed at a government that had already calculated the cost of their rescue and found it too high. Foy Kohler and the architects of the Cold War had decided that the stability of the world depended on maintaining a working relationship with Moscow, a relationship that could not bear the weight of public accusations regarding kidnapped soldiers. The architecture of ice was not just the physical reality of Siberia. It was the frozen heart of the American diplomatic establishment, a structure built on the belief that the suffering of the few was a necessary price for the survival of the many. As the 1940s turned into the 1950s and the Korean War poured fresh fuel onto the fire, this architecture would only harden, trapping a new generation of soldiers in the spaces between the files, lost in a bureaucratic winter that showed no sign of ending. The war for the soul of the world was not only fought with rifles and radar, it was fought with frequencies. By 1949, the Iron Curtain had descended with a physical finality, sealing off the east with barbed wire and minefields, but the airwaves remained porous. The voice of America was the United States' primary weapon in this ethereal battlefield, a broadcast service designed to pierce the silence of the Soviet bloc and deliver the one commodity the Kremlin feared most, the truth. It was a mission of staggering moral clarity, intending to speak directly to the oppressed, to tell the Polish dock worker and the Russian intellectual that they had not been forgotten. Yet, when Foy D. Kohler assumed the directorship of the VOA in the autumn of 1949, the clarity of this mission began to blur under the gray filter of diplomatic caution, transforming the radio station from a sword of truth into a shield for State Department policy. Kohler brought to the VOA the same cool, detached pragmatism that had defined his tenure in Moscow, viewing the broadcast service not as a crusade for liberation, but as an instrument of foreign policy that must remain synchronized with the delicate maneuvering of Washington. In his view, the truth was not an absolute value to be broadcast at maximum volume. It was a tactical asset to be deployed, withheld, or modulated depending on the geopolitical weather. This philosophy created a profound dissonance within the organization, pitting the passionate émigré journalists, men and women who had fled the very regimes they were now broadcasting to, against the career bureaucrats who feared that a broadcast too sharp or too provocative might upset the fragile status quo. The refugees wanted to scream about the atrocities they had witnessed, while Kohler and his lieutenants wanted to modulate the tone to a polite diplomatic murmur. The most damning manifestation of this policy of suppression centered on the Katyn massacre, a crime that stood as a gaping wound in the psyche of Eastern Europe. In 1940, the Soviet secret police had executed nearly 22,000 Polish military officers and intelligentsia in the forests of Katyn and other killing fields, burying them in mass graves in a calculated attempt to decapitate the Polish nation. For years, the Soviet Union had blamed this atrocity on the Nazis. a lie that was convenient for the Allies to accept during the war, when Stalin was a necessary partner against Hitler. But by 1950, the alliance was dead, the evidence of Soviet guilt was overwhelming, and the Polish people looked to the West to finally validate their suffering and speak the name of the true executioner. Instead of vindication, they received a calculated silence. Under the guidance of the State Department and enforced by Kohler's administration at the VOA, the scripts that mentioned Katyn were sanitized, diluted, or killed entirely. The reasoning was a masterpiece of bureaucratic cowardice. To accuse the Soviet Union of such a monstrous war crime would be unnecessarily provocative. The diplomats argued that rubbing Stalin's nose in the blood of Katyn would serve no strategic purpose and might derail delicate negotiations regarding Berlin or the Korean Peninsula. The truth about the massacre became a bargaining chip that was discarded to purchase a temporary and illusory diplomatic calm, sacrificing the moral authority of the United States on the altar of expediency. Inside the cramped studios of the VOA in New York, this policy led to furious, hushed battles between the broadcasters and the censors. Polish writers who tried to tell the full story found their paragraphs slashed with red pencil, their impassioned pleas for justice replaced with vague neutral language that attributed the crime to controversial circumstances rather than Soviet bullets. The betrayal was intimate and visceral. These broadcasters were being asked to lie to their own countrymen, to participate in the gaslighting of a nation that was already living under the boot of a totalitarian regime. They saw Kohler not as a protector of free speech, but as a warden of the official narrative, a man who prioritized the comfort of the aggressor over the dignity of the victim. Kohler later defended his tenure against charges of censorship, framing his actions as necessary discipline in a chaotic environment, but the record reveals a consistent pattern of prioritizing stability over confrontation. He belonged to a school of thought that believed the Soviet beast could be tamed through rational engagement, that if the West remained polite and predictable, the Kremlin would eventually reciprocate. This worldview failed to understand that to a gangster regime like Stalin's, politeness was not seen as a virtue, but as a sign of weakness, an invitation to push harder. By suppressing the truth about Katyn, the United States did not buy goodwill. It merely demonstrated that it was willing to compromise its own foundational values when the political price became too high. This culture of caution had a direct and tragic correlation to the issue of American detainees. If the State Department was willing to silence the truth about 22,000 dead Polish officers to avoid annoying Moscow, it required very little mental gymnastics to justify silence regarding a few hundred missing American soldiers. The mindset was identical. The individual case, no matter how horrific, must not be allowed to disrupt the big picture. The censorship at the VOA was the public face of the same policy that kept the files on missing GIs locked in the vaults of the embassy. It was a strategy of erasure where inconvenient human beings, whether dead in a Polish forest or alive in a Siberian mine, were airbrushed out of the official picture to ensure the smooth operation of international relations. The listeners behind the Iron Curtain, huddled around their radios in Warsaw, Prague, and Moscow, listening through the static of Soviet jamming, began to detect the hollowness in the American voice. They heard the hesitation, the omissions, the carefully parsed phrases that danced around the brutal realities of their daily lives. For a prisoner in the Gulag who managed to catch a snatch of a broadcast, perhaps from a radio smuggled by a guard or a free worker, the silence was devastating. He was waiting for a signal that his country was fighting for him, that the West knew the nature of the monster that held him. Instead, he heard a voice that was polite, measured, and careful not to offend the jailer. Kohler's time at the VOA solidified his reputation as a safe pair of hands, a man who could be trusted to execute policy without letting emotions interfere with the machinery of state. He had proven that he could suppress the truth when necessary, that he could stare into the face of a moral outrage and blink. This quality made him invaluable to a Washington establishment that was increasingly terrified of the uncontrollable passions of the Cold War. As he prepared to move on to higher positions, eventually returning to Moscow as ambassador, he carried with him the lessons of the radio years, that truth is dangerous, that silence is a tool, and that the most effective diplomat is the one who knows exactly what not to say. The tragedy of the voice of America in this era was not that it failed to speak, but that it whispered when it should have roared. It became a mirror of the men who ran it, technically proficient, intellectually sophisticated, and morally paralyzed. The voice became a whisper, lost in the howling wind of the Soviet winter, leaving the victims of the regime, both the dead in Katyn and the living in Kolyma, trapped in a silence that felt like a second death. The betrayal was now complete. The physical abandonment in the camps was matched by the rhetorical abandonment on the airwaves, creating a hermetically sealed world where the suffering of the innocent was acknowledged by no one, not even the champions of liberty. The year 1962 marked the moment when the Cold War ceased to be a metaphor and threatened to become a terminal event for the human species. When Foy Kohler returned to Moscow, this time not as a caretaker, but as the United States ambassador, he stepped into a city that was no longer just the capital of a rival empire, but the control center of a doomsday machine. The atmosphere had shifted from the grim, grinding paranoia of the Stalin years to the volatile, shoe-banging theatricality of Nikita Khrushchev. It was an era of high-stakes brinkmanship where the currency of diplomacy was no longer just territory or influence, but the continued existence of civilization itself. In this rarefied air, the specific agonizing plight of individual human beings, the soldier freezing in Vorkuta, the pilot forgotten in Kolyma, became infinitesimally small, reduced to microscopic specks of dust on a chessboard dominated by nuclear queens. Kohler's appointment was the culmination of a career built on prudence and the suppression of emotional impulses. He was the perfect instrument for the crisis that was about to unfold in October, a man whose blood temperature seemed to match the cool marble of the State Department floors. When American U-2 spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, the world held its breath, counting down the minutes to midnight. In the history books, this is Kohler's finest hour, the moment where his philosophy of quiet diplomacy was vindicated on a global scale. He served as the critical conduit between the White House and the Kremlin, delivering the messages that would eventually diffuse the tension, remaining calm while generals on both sides sharpened their swords. He was the steady hand, the rational actor, the man who helped ensure that the sun rose the next morning. But there is a terrible jagged shadow cast by this brilliance. The logic that saved the world during the Cuban Missile Crisis was the same logic that doomed the men left behind in the Soviet darkness. The crisis reinforced the absolute primacy of the big picture. In the calculus of October 1962, the primary objective was to prevent the launch of missiles. Anything that might distract from that goal, anything that might irritate Khrushchev or complicate the delicate psychological interplay between the leaders, had to be jettisoned. The American detainees rotting in the camps 3,000 miles to the east were the ultimate distraction. To raise the issue of kidnapped soldiers during the negotiations to save the world would have been seen as madness by the wise men of Washington, a petty grievance that risked the incineration of millions. Thus, the great peace that followed the crisis was built on a foundation of necessary forgetting. The relief that washed over the world was palpable. Champagne corks popped in Washington and Moscow, and a new era of détente began to thaw the relations between the superpowers. But for the men in the Gulag, this thaw was a cruel illusion. They heard the news of the peaceful resolution through the grapevine of the camps. Whispers passed from a guard to a trustee, from a trustee to a prisoner. They likely felt a surge of hope, believing that with the tension de-escalated, with the ambassadors talking and the direct hotline established, their time had finally come. They did not understand that they were the price of that peace, that their continued imprisonment was the silence required to keep the music playing at the diplomatic receptions. The tragedy of the post-1962 era was the normalization of the abnormal. The existence of American captives in the Soviet Union became an open secret within the intelligence community, a fact that was known but not acted upon. Reports continued to filter out sightings of men in the psychiatric wards of Leningrad, accounts of Americans transferred to secret cities in the Urals, but they were met with a wall of bureaucratic fatalism. The State Department, under Kohler's stewardship in Moscow, had perfected the art of the non-denial denial. When families pressed for answers, they were told that no stone was being left unturned, a phrase that masked the reality that no stones were being moved at all for fear of what might crawl out from underneath. This period saw the crystallization of cocktail diplomacy, a grotesque ritual where the social lubricant of high society greased the gears of betrayal. Ambassador Kohler was a master of this environment, hosting lavish receptions at Spaso House, where Soviet officials could drink bourbon and discuss the ballet, while he politely avoided the subjects that might spoil the mood. It requires a specific kind of moral dissociation to clink glasses with a man who you know is holding your countrymen in cages. It requires one to view the prisoner not as a brother or a son, but as a sunk cost, a debit on a ledger that has already been balanced and closed. The polite diplomat believes that maintaining access to the enemy is more important than confronting the enemy's crimes, creating a feedback loop where the relationship is preserved at the expense of the very people the relationship is supposed to protect. The Soviet authorities understood this psychology perfectly and exploited it with ruthless efficiency. They knew that men like Kohler were rational, that they prioritized stability over justice. They knew that as long as they kept the prisoners hidden deep enough, as long as they denied everything with a straight face, the Americans would not risk the broader relationship for the sake of a few lost souls. The Gulag system, therefore, became a black box that the diplomats agreed not to open. The Soviets kept the box sealed, and the Americans pretended not to notice it sitting in the corner of the room. It was a conspiracy of silence, a tacit agreement between enemies to ignore the human debris of their conflict. Deep in the Siberian interior, the consequences of this rationality were measured in frostbite and madness. The men who had been captured in the late 1940s or early 1950s were now entering their second decade of captivity. They were no longer the young, strong soldiers who had been snatched from the streets of Vienna or the battlefields of Korea. They were broken men, their bodies ravaged by scurvy and pellagra, their minds fracturing under the strain of absolute isolation. They had been stripped of their names, their ranks, and their citizenship. To the guards, they were just zeks, inmates, indistinguishable from the mass of suffering humanity that the Soviet state consumed. The only thing that distinguished them was the fading memory of a home that had stopped looking for them, a country that was currently celebrating its diplomatic triumphs while they scraped the ice from the walls of their barracks to melt for water. The disconnect between the timeline of the diplomat and the timeline of the prisoner is the heart of this horror. For Kohler, 1962 to 1966 were years of professional success, a time of treaties and summits. For the prisoner, those same years were a seamless eternity of white noise, a blur of hunger and cold where time lost its meaning. The diplomat measures success by what doesn't happen, the war that didn't start, the bomb that didn't fall. The prisoner measures failure by what does happen, the friend who didn't wake up this morning, the letter that didn't arrive, the rescue that never came. By prioritizing the former, Kohler and his generation rendered the latter inevitable, sacrificing the tangible reality of the suffering individual for the abstract concept of geopolitical stability. As Kohler prepared to leave Moscow in 1966, ending his tour as ambassador, he left behind a legacy of stabilized relations and managed tensions. He was feted as a peacemaker. But as his plane lifted off from Sheremetyevo Airport, banking over the vast, snow-covered expanse of the Russian landscape, it flew over the unmarked graves of men who had waited in vain for his voice to be raised in their defense. The silence he left behind was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of the tomb, a quiet bought with the betrayal of the faithful. The summit of betrayal was not a single meeting, but a 4-year-long reception where the guests agreed that the screams from the basement were simply not loud enough to interrupt the toast. The geography of the Soviet Union in this era was not defined by rivers or mountains, but by the archipelago of the dead. Beyond the Urals, beyond the tree line, the silence of the State Department translated directly into the physical destruction of the human body. This was not a theoretical exercise in foreign policy. It was an industrial slaughter where the coordinates of Vorkuta, Norilsk, and Kolyma marked the locations where civilization ended and a primitive frozen hell began. The men who vanished into this void arrived not as soldiers of a victorious army, but as livestock stripped of their uniforms, their dog tags, and their names, issued a quilted jacket, a vatnik, often stripped from the corpse of a previous inmate, infested with lice that swarmed over the skin like a second living layer. The first sensory assault was the smell, a thick, suffocating miasma of unwashed bodies, rotting cabbage, cheap tobacco, and the sweet, sickly scent of gangrene that permeated the barracks where men were packed so tightly onto wooden shelves that they could not turn over without disturbing the entire row. The daily routine in the land of white death was a slow-motion execution designed to extract every ounce of labor before the inevitable biological collapse. The prisoner woke at 4 a.m. to the banging of a metal rail, consuming a breakfast of watery gruel and a ration of bread that was heavy, damp, and mixed with sawdust to increase its weight. This wet clay in the stomach served as the only fuel for 14 hours of mining gold or uranium in open pits, where the temperature hovered at 50 degrees below zero. In this cold, metal became brittle and snapped, while human skin touching steel bonded to it instantly, tearing away in bloody strips if pulled free. The American pilot, whose hands were once skilled enough to manipulate the delicate controls of a fighter plane, found his fingers swollen into useless clubs, cracked and bleeding, wrapping around the handle of a shovel that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Physical disintegration in the camps was rapid and grotesque, a devolution from human to creature. Scurvy attacked the gums, loosening the teeth until they could be wiggled out with a tongue. Pellagra turned the skin into rough, scaling lizard hide. But the most terrifying affliction was the goneril phase, the slow slide into the state of the dokodyaga, the goner. This was the point where the body began to cannibalize itself, consuming its own muscle tissue for energy, causing the buttocks to atrophy and the skin to hang in folds, while the eyes retreated deep into the skull, burning with a feverish feral light. The prisoner stopped looking like a man and began to look like a biological accident, a skeletal figure shuffling through the snow, driven only by the reptilian need to find warmth or a scrap of food. Amidst this physical decay, the mind of the American prisoner was subjected to a specific, unique torture that his Soviet counterparts did not share: the torture of expectation. A Russian dissident in the Gulag knew he was doomed. He understood that his own government hated him and that no one was coming to save him. The American, however, clung to the myth of his own indispensability, remembering the rhetoric of the 4th of July and the promise that no man is left behind. This belief was his sustenance, but it was also his poison. Every time a new transport arrived, he scanned the faces for a compatriot, asking for news, imagining the negotiations taking place in Moscow, constructing a vivid fantasy where Foy Kohler pounded on a table to demand his release. He did not know that to the men in the tuxedos he was merely an irritant, a file that had been closed to ensure the smooth signing of a trade deal. This hope was a cruelty far sharper than the hunger, keeping the prisoner alive just long enough to realize he had been discarded. The moment of realization, the breaking point, usually occurred in the camp hospital, a place where the sick were laid on bare boards to die, often stripped of their clothing so it could be reused by the living. There, in the delirium of typhus or the final coma of starvation, the American soldier finally understood that the cavalry was not coming. Eyewitness accounts from returning German and Japanese POWs in the mid-1950s provided snapshots of these final moments, telling of an American named Major Cummings in a camp near Taishe who died screaming the names of his children, or a young man from Chicago in the copper mines of Jezkazgan who had lost his feet to frostbite and begged the guards to shoot him, only to be told that bullets cost money while the cold was free. The indignity of the death was compounded by the anonymity of the grave. When an American died in the Gulag, there was no funeral, no flag draped over a coffin, only a tag tied to the big toe of the corpse, if the toe was still there, with the prisoner's number scrawled on it. The body was dragged out beyond the perimeter wire, often on a sled, and dumped into a mass pit or a shallow trench, dynamited out of the permafrost. In winter, the bodies would not decompose. They would freeze into statues of agony, preserved in the ice, stacked like cordwood to be scavenged by wolves. This was the final resting place of the men who fought for the free world, a frozen hole in the taiga, thousands of miles from the nearest flower, buried under the indifference of their enemies and the cowardice of their leaders. The juxtaposition of this horror against the life of Foy Kohler is nauseating. While the diplomat selected a tie for a summit meeting, an American citizen fought a rat for a piece of bread crust. While the State Department drafted memos about mutual understanding, a U.S. Army private was beaten to death by a criminal gang for his boots. The distance between these two worlds was not measured in miles, but in morality. The men in the camps had not just been captured by the Soviets, they had been exiled from the conscience of their own nation, treated as collateral damage of a peace that required human sacrifice to sustain itself. They were the men left behind in the high-definition horror of a hell that their own government agreed to ignore. The tragedy of Foy Kohler and the State Department in this era is not that they were monsters in the theatrical sense. They did not twist their mustaches or cackle with delight at the suffering of their countrymen. They were instead the ultimate manifestations of the professional bureaucrat, men who had severed the connection between their actions and the moral consequences of those actions. In the sterile air-conditioned corridors of Washington and the hushed offices of the embassy, the human being ceased to be a flesh and blood entity and was transmuted into a file, a dossier, a problem to be managed rather than a life to be saved. This is the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt spoke of, transposed from the trial of Eichmann to the career path of the American Foreign Service officer, where the ability to process a tragedy without emotion was viewed not as a defect, but as a qualification for high office. Careerism acts as a powerful sedative for the conscience. To rise in the ranks of the diplomatic corps during the height of the Cold War, one had to demonstrate sound judgment, a code phrase for the willingness to prioritize the institution over the individual. A diplomat who became too emotionally invested in specific cases, who pounded the table and demanded justice for a lost pilot, was viewed as unstable, a liability who lacked the necessary detachment to play the great game of nations. Foy Kohler understood this unwritten rule perfectly. He knew that the path to the ambassadorship lay in being a realist, in proving that he could subordinate the messy, ugly details of human suffering to the pristine geometric logic of containment and détente. If he had stormed into the Kremlin and called the Soviet premier a kidnapper, he would have been recalled, his career over, his influence extinguished. So he chose the career, and in doing so, he chose the silence. This choice was justified by the terrifying mathematics of the greater good. The logic was seductive and absolute. If pushing too hard for the release of a few dozen or a few hundred men risked derailing nuclear arms negotiations, then those men had to be sacrificed to save the millions who would die in a potential World War III. It was a utilitarian calculus that weighed the lives of the soldiers against the survival of the species, and the soldiers lost every time. The detainees became the necessary collateral damage of peace, the grease in the gears of the doomsday machine. But this logic relied on a fundamental betrayal of the social contract, the unspoken promise that a nation will move heaven and earth to protect those it sends into harm's way. By breaking this contract, Kohler and his contemporaries saved the peace, but they hollowed out the moral core of the civilization they were ostensibly protecting. The language used in the cables and memos of the time reflects this psychological partition. Horrific realities were draped in euphemisms designed to strip them of their urgency. A soldier freezing to death in a camp was a consular access issue. A pilot disappearing into the Gulag was a discrepancy in repatriation figures. The refusal of the Soviets to provide information was an administrative impasse. These words acted as a buffer, a layer of insulation that allowed the diplomats to handle the radioactive truth without getting burned. They turned screams into syntax, processing the agony of the abandoned through the typewriter until it became just another stack of paper to be filed, categorized, and ultimately ignored. Inside the mind of the bureaucrat, this dissociation creates a separate reality where one can believe in one's own righteousness while facilitating a crime. Kohler could look at himself in the mirror and see a dedicated public servant, a man working tirelessly to prevent nuclear annihilation, completely compartmentalizing the fact that his tireless work involves stepping over the bodies of the men he was sworn to represent. This is the mechanism that allows the cocktail parties to continue. When the diplomat raises a glass with his Soviet counterpart, he is not toasting a jailer. He is toasting a partner in stability. The man rotting in the cell becomes invisible, erased by the brightness of the chandelier and the warmth of the alcohol, reduced to a ghost that haunts only the memory, not the policy. The arrogance of this position is breathtaking. It assumes that the diplomat possesses a godlike perspective, the right to decide who lives and who dies for the sake of the empire. It transforms the citizen from the master of the state into its raw material, a resource to be expended in the pursuit of higher strategic goals. The anger that arises from this story is not just about the cruelty of the Soviets, that is expected, but about the betrayal of the Guardians. The indignation stems from the realization that the lock on the prison door was not just turned by the enemy, but was reinforced by the indifference of the very men who carried the keys to the rescue. The bureaucrat does not kill with a gun. He kills with a memo, with a delay, with a decision to do nothing, and he sleeps soundly at night because the file is closed and the procedure was followed. Capture in war is a recognized hazard of the profession, a calculated risk accepted by every soldier who laces up a boot. To be shot, to be wounded, to be taken prisoner by an honorable enemy. These are the misfortunes of the battlefield, the grim lottery of conflict. But to be forgotten is not a misfortune. It is a violation of the most sacred covenant between a nation and its defenders. The indignation that burns at the heart of this story does not stem from the fact that American soldiers suffered. Soldiers have always suffered. It stems from the fact that their suffering was classified as a state secret by the very government that sent them to fight, transforming their captivity from a tragedy of war into a crime of peace. The true horror lies in the deliberate nature of the inaction. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed and the archives creaked open in the early 1990s, the fragments of paper that tumbled out confirmed the worst nightmares of the families who had waited for decades. There were transfer documents, interrogation logs, and psychiatric evaluations of American citizens held long after the wars had officially ended. These papers proved that the paranoid mothers and the hysterical wives were right, and the calm, rational men like Foy Kohler were wrong, or worse, that they were lying. The evidence existed. The intelligence reports were accurate. The sightings were real. The government had not been blind. It had simply chosen to close its eyes. Defenders of the diplomatic strategy will argue that Kohler and his colleagues were playing a game with stakes so high that individual lives became statistically irrelevant. They will point to the Cuban Missile Crisis and say, look, he saved the world. Is the price of a few hundred soldiers not worth the survival of billions? This is the argument of the utilitarian, the logic of the actuary applied to the human soul. It suggests that there is an acceptable exchange rate for betrayal, a certain number of men who can be fed into the furnace to keep the engine of history running. But this logic ignores the moral rot that sets in when a society accepts such a trade. A peace that is purchased with the blood of the abandoned is a peace built on a lie, a hollow victory that preserves the body of the nation while selling its soul. The betrayal was not passive. It was active and sustained. It required a constant effort to suppress the truth, to gaslight the families who came knocking on the doors of the State Department. For decades, parents were told that their sons were presumed dead, that the rumors of survival were cruel hoaxes, that they should move on. This was a second violence inflicted upon the victims, a psychological war waged against the grieving to protect the diplomatic narrative. To look a mother in the eye and tell her that her son is dead while knowing there is a file on your desk suggesting he is alive in a labor camp requires a level of professional detachment that borders on sociopathy. It is the unforgivable sin of the Cold War bureaucrat, the prioritization of career comfort over the agony of the citizen. This indignation is permanent because the crime can never be undone. There is no remedy for a man who died alone in the snow 40 years ago. There is no apology that can bring back the wasted years of a prisoner who sat in a cell wondering why his country had gone silent. The legacy of Foy Kohler and the policy of quiet diplomacy is a scar on the history of the American century, a reminder that the great triumphs of the era were shadowed by a deep, shameful silence. We celebrate the treaties and the summits, the toasts and the handshakes, but we must also acknowledge the empty chairs at the tables of families across America, the spaces left by men who were traded away for a geopolitical advantage that, in the end, meant nothing to the dead. Foy D. Kohler passed away in 1990, just as the empire he had spent his life containing began to crumble into dust. He died in the comfort of a warm bed, surrounded by the murmur of a loving family and the respect of a grateful nation, eulogized in the newspapers as a titan of diplomacy and a guardian of peace. His obituary listed his triumphs: the defusing of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the steady hand during the Berlin tensions, the knighthood of the Foreign Service. He was buried with honors, his life celebrated as a testament to the virtues of patience and reason. A man who had navigated the treacherous waters of the 20th century and brought the ship of state safely into the harbor. The men he left behind did not have the luxury of a eulogy or a marked grave. Their bodies are currently part of the geology of the Russian taiga, fused with the permafrost in the vast unmarked cemeteries that ring the former Gulag camps. There are no headstones for them, only the silent testimony of the birch trees that grow over the bone fields of Kolyma and Vorkuta. They did not die surrounded by family. They died surrounded by strangers and guards, their final moments defined by the crushing realization that they had been erased from the memory of the country they served. The contrast between the diplomat's velvet exit and the soldier's frozen end is the final brutal punctuation mark on this history, a silent scream that echoes across the decades. The legacy of this era is therefore a dual one, a coin with two very different faces. On one side is the shiny, polished narrative of the Cold War victory, the story of how the West outlasted the Soviet Union through containment and resolve. On the other side is the rusted, jagged reality of the moral price that was paid for that victory, the story of the men who were treated as expendable currency in the transaction. The long peace was bought in part with their silence. The stability that allowed American suburbs to flourish and economies to boom was underwritten by the decision to leave a few hundred souls in the dark to let the snow cover their tracks so that the diplomats could continue to smile at the reception. This story leaves us not with a resolution, but with a haunting. It is the haunting of the empty chair at the dinner table, the space that was never filled in the homes of the families who waited. For 40 years, mothers kept lights burning in windows. Wives refused to remarry, and children grew up chasing the phantom of a father who had vanished into the mist. This generational trauma is the collateral damage of bureaucracy, the invisible wound inflicted by the decision to prioritize the state over the citizen. The files in the State Department may be closed, but the psychological scar on the nation remains open, a reminder that the government is capable of a coldness that rivals the Siberian winter. When we look back at the architects of the Cold War, at the wise men like Kohler, we must temper our gratitude with vigilance. The lesson of the Gulag is that the most dangerous people in a government are not always the ones shouting from a podium or threatening war. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the quiet professionals, the men in the well-tailored suits who are willing to make the hard choices, that sacrifice the innocent for the sake of the system. They are the ones who can rationalize a betrayal until it looks like a strategy, who can sign a document that condemns a man to death and then go home to eat dinner without missing a beat. We remember them today not to tarnish the victory of freedom, but to understand its cost. We remember the pilot who looked up at the Siberian sky and wondered if anyone was looking back. We remember the soldier who died whispering the name of a town in Kansas or Georgia. We remember them because their government did not. The indignation we feel is the only justice they will ever receive, a belated recognition that their lives mattered, that they were not just numbers in a dossier, but human beings who were owed a debt that was never paid. The wind continues to blow over the ruins today. The watchtowers have rotted, and the Soviet Union has dissolved into the pages of history books. But the silence remains. It is a heavy, accusing silence, a reminder that the most dangerous evil is not always the one that screams with rage, but the one that speaks in a calm, measured voice. The one that wears a tuxedo and holds a champagne glass while the world freezes outside the window. As the lights fade on this story, we are left with the image of a single candle flickering in the snow. It burns for the forgotten. It burns for the betrayed. The chair at the dinner table is empty. The diplomat is gone. But the truth remains carved into the ice, standing eternally in the cold, watching us from the other side of the glass.